So I'm very happy. I'm also very proud to welcome back Theodore Spyropoulos. He's been twice with us as a member of the end-of-year jury. And on these occasions we have learned that Theo's soft-spoken manner stands in the most intriguing relationship to his incisive, critically keen and profoundly informed observations about the work we have reviewed. And we got also a taste of that earlier today in the review that we have just begun, that continues tomorrow and the morning after. So it's an honor and an inspiration to have you here, Theo, as a guest on those occasions and no less this time around. I'm honored to welcome you back, both for the review, not the least a lecture, and it's an important moment, I think, for us to learn a little bit more about your ideas and work. Work which is undertaken in part in Minimaforms, a experimental architecture and design practice that Theo co-founded with his brother Stephen in 2002. And their work is in the permanent collection of the FRAC Centre in France, the Signum Foundation in Poland, the Archigram Archive in England. It's been exhibited, amongst other places, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Detroit Institute of the Arts, the ICA in London, the Futura Gallery in Prague, and the Slovak National Gallery in Bratislava. And together with his academic work at the AA, Minimaform is, of course, then the crucible of the years for Theo to develop ideas and approaches to architectural design and urbanism. The other being the DRL, that is AA's Design Research Laboratory. Theo was a co-director of this from 2005 to 2009, and since 2009 he's been the sole director of the program. It is basically the AA's largest program. It's been motor for its profile for so many years. And since its inception in the mid-1990s, rooted in fact, in part, at least in Jeffrey Kiffner's postgraduate studio at the AA, and initially then established by Brett Steele and Patrick Schumacher of Hadid Architects, DRL has risen to be one of the world's leading architectural and urban research programs on a postgraduate level. It cannot be underestimated, I think, how influential the program has been and continues to be under your directorship. So with Theo at the helm of this small but also powerful faculty, the work at DRL includes experiments in computation, material, behavior, generative design, fabrication, prototyping, and urban development. Now, amongst other schools, Theo has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, the Royal College of Art, and a long list of institutions that has been visited for lectures and research collaborations. He was a visiting research fellow at MIT's Center for Advanced Visual Studies, working with the Interrogative Design Group, and he co-founded a new media and information research initiative at the AA in London. Among his credentials and honors is also the 2013 ACADIA Award of Excellence for his educational work directing the DRL. So, at the same time, he also published his book, Adaptive Ecologies, Correlated Systems of Living, and that was together with John Fraser and Patrick. Yeah. Before landing squarely in academia and with Minimaforms, Theo worked as a project architect for the offices of respectively Peter Eisenman, as much as that of Zaha Hadid Architects, and on well-known projects such as the City of Culture Complex at Santiago de Compostela, the O2 Arena, as well as London's bid for the 2012 Olympics. When Theo speaks, we enjoy his erudite understanding of the discipline, and I would imagine we also hear and echo this impressive professional experience, this background. Before getting there, though, he studied at the AA, the Barbican School of Architecture, and the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Theo's current work, as much as the studio at DRL, currently investigates a machine-based behavioral approach to architectural design by generating self-regulating and deployable soft systems. Thus, I presume that's also the reason for the title of tonight's lecture, Behaviors. Please join me in welcoming Theo.
I'm going to take a glass now. So. We're making a habit of actually coming here now for the last couple of years, so for me I feel it's quite a familiar territory, but at the same time humbled to be kicking off what is, I think, a very impressive lecture series. And a lot of the work that I'm going to try to share with you is caught up, I think, in the complexities of what it means to try to inquire about architecture and about art and design through practice, through education, and to be honest, kind of forever a student of this whole thing. I titled the lecture Behaviors because at the heart of it, I think with my brother, with my colleagues, with my students, we're trying to explore relationships that see in between how things actually communicate, how they interact, without a kind of orthodoxy or without a kind of prescriptive idea of what architecture should be, what art should be, but what it can be. To speculate on possibilities and to kind of open that up and to make that accessible. I'm going to make an argument that behavior as a conceptual strategy is a way to explore that. To kick off the lecture, I'd like to kick off with this provocation that Hans Hollein put out in an issue of Bau, which was really a manifesto of sorts about everything being architecture, all is architecture, with images and collages that were provocative, expressing kind of strategies about the ephemerality of architecture, the constructual, perceptual project of architecture. He's also quite known as saying that we don't need to redesign cities, we just need to take better drugs. He made a statement actually as a provocation for it, where he said a true architecture of our time will have to redefine itself and expand its means, and many areas outside of traditional building will enter the realm of architecture, as architecture and architects will have to enter new fields. All are architects, everything is architecture. And I think, to be honest with you, if it was a provocation in the late 60s, it stands to be a provocation today as well, except the difference is what many things at the time were more provocations for the sake of provocation. The reality and the radicality of our contemporary condition, I think, resonates in a very different context of how these words could be received today. So if for Hollein, his concept of all is architecture, I think for myself and my brother, I would say all is behavior. And part of that is actually opening up a kind of discourse that I think was prevalent from the 50s till today. Von Forrester was a cybernetician and also head of the Biological Institute of Computation at IIT. And he's quite well known as a man in what was discussed as second-order cybernetics, about understanding, about quotes like this, the world as we perceive it is our own invention. It's part of a, I think, deeply rooted kind of exploration in terms of science and systems, but also in terms of the constructions of how we learn, how we understand, and how we explore. My history, I think Johan was very expanded about it, makes me feel like I'm much older than I hope that I am. But it's kind of a many lives and part of a kind of evolving project in its own right, and it has a history and a context which has seen most of that, and that's been my time in London. It was particularly when I moved back when my brother was studying in Central St. Martin's, and I started to teach at the AA. And the Architectural Association, for me, fundamentally is really a belief system. It's not really an institution. It's a belief that actually you come together and you're part of this larger continuing experiment, which, to be honest with you, this title of what James Gowan put together as a book, I think is very important. And part of that, and this isn't really a talk about the AA, but it's important about the culture that resonates around the subject of architecture and design, and experimentation, and I really am a proponent of that design really does matter, and it takes many different forms, and we have to construct frameworks, particularly in education, to allow for those things to manifest. And Boyarsky is the chairman that is probably most synonymous with the school's renaissance. And here's a guy outside of the AA in Bedford Square on an elephant, and you can pass judgment on that, but that's fact. Beyond the elephant and the kind of cuteness of things like that was really a deep interest in people and personalities in terms of creating and cultivating projects for architecture, exploring youth, and actually a sensibility, I think, of young designers and giving them the space to try things. We have a history of a lot of pretty famous people. Their fame is not really important. I'm going to make an argument that something else is. So Zaha is one of them, and it is her anniversary, actually, a couple weeks ago of her passing. And her, in particular, for me, is an important character because she is one of the world's, or was one of the world's most important architects, and even at the height of that, felt the responsibility to at least participate in the culture of the AA. Every interview she gave, she always spoke about her career started with her coming to London and coming to the school. She would join our DRL reviews, maybe for one project or whatever, but the effort of being there is really important. I think that effort of feeling that you're part of that community and to consider yourself that the community is not about AA, it's really about like-minded people in different institutions, practitioners that actually believe that experimentation matters. And if you see that experimentation, you may recognize certain projects. We saw a reference today of the Fun Palace of Cedric Price. Well, this is Cedric Price with Gordon Pask and John Fraser and the students of the AA working on a lot of those ideas together, a kind of collective co-authorship of something. My argument is that that doesn't really necessitate much other than a strategy for sort of working. This is the DRL. It doesn't really matter who's the teacher or the student. We're collectively working on projects that are much bigger than ours, individual pursuits, but they're part of a larger kind of engagement with things. And I would make the argument that the project of today really matters. And to have the courage to sort of explore those ideas, I think is really important, and it should be enabled, I think, by the fact that there's a history of this kind of experimentation. This is the Osaka Expo, which was another reference that was made today. You have people like Kenzo Tange, Kikotaki, Isozaki designing robots and so forth. These were proof of concepts, I would make the argument, to make accessible, to communicate, to invite people to speculate about what it is. And making, for me, is a really important feature of a lot of the work that we do, because we have very limited means, like most people do. But it's also a reminder that those events and those projects and those installations and so forth were moments of time, particularly of the 60s and 70s, which was really a convergence, pre-internet, of characters like this. For example, Moshe Safdie and Dennis Crompton from Archigram, Yona Friedman from Paris. Really a meeting of characters to discuss architecture. And so as much as events or lectures and public programs, buildings, and the facility of actually bringing people together, I think, is very important. And I think maybe what's also important, Moshe Safdie is still today most well known for the thesis project that he finished when he was a student, which he built as Habitat. So 24 years old, straight out of school. If you think that you're too young to actually make a project that is really your career, here's a man in his 70s who is a testimony to those initial ideas being given the opportunity, being realized, still drive a lot of the things that he is trying to do. Another example that I want to bring is the fact that architecture doesn't necessarily mean building. So for example, Nicholas Negroponte, who was an architect, graduated from MIT. 2 years later, he set up something called the Architecture Machine Group. The Architecture Machine Group's initial mandate was very straightforward, simplistic, let's put it for lack of a better word. New tools, CAD systems, how would that evolve what the architect would be? What began as something like that evolved as a 10-year experiment, let's call it. And what was known as the MIT what was known as the Architecture Machine Group became something called the MIT Media Lab. But the Media Lab and all of those things, moving into the world of pure communication and interface and all of those kind of technologies that we've witnessed, was part of a lot of the kind of radical discourse of the time. Architects who said that building wasn't architecture and moving towards more ephemeral things, to more communication-based things. And you could find form in a very direct and very real-world application as the whole societal change was actually shifting. My argument would be that we witnessed that ephemerality, and architecture and space as a medium, as an interface, which is possibly how I would define architecture, is more important now than ever. And part of that is to sort of make things accessible and to make them shared. I think the way that we generally work in the studio and Minimaforms of my brother is very collaborative, and it doesn't necessarily matter if we're working on interfaces, on the design of vehicles or master plans or whatever. It's about a certain sensibility. It's not about a style. We're not trying to put forward a form. We believe that projects make demands, and we sort of give ourselves the time as a form of design research to work on that stuff. So some of that stuff is just continuous project preoccupations of things. And sometimes that lends us into territories which are a little bit unknown for us. So for example, media is not found. Okay. Imagine some robots and tentacles, and I'll show it to you later, right? It's one of those things when you test the videos and then something happens. So if you imagine some robots and tentacles and those things, from a more robotic and tangible kind of strategies of making things to kind of very ephemeral strategies like constructing atmospheres and so forth, for us fundamentally it's about communication and trying to facilitate that. And in parallel, Minimaforms and my time in the DRL were set up together. And in the DRL, to be honest with you, we've always been wrestling, particularly with issues of computation and making. And we get sometimes, we have our 20th anniversary coming up this year. And at the time of our 10th anniversary, we had this cover of Architectural Review, journal, which said, "What planet are they on?" Basically saying that we've changed the language of architecture forever, whatever, statements that actually don't mean very much, but are provocations, partly because I think there is a strategy of not knowing what these things are, or they look alien, or at the time that we were doing these things that were just novel. So for the 10th anniversary, it was very important for us to sort of try to do a proof of concept. So we held a competition and we did an exhibition. The exhibition was everything that our graduates did afterwards. And the competition was to work with Reader, who designs these clad system, fiber-reinforced concrete panels to make a structure out of it. And this was won by two of our ex-graduates. But it was like a side project that we were building with the students of that year as a form of design build. So these kind of projects are experiments in their right, but also when I started teaching, and that was in 2002 over there, the first things that we were working on with a colleague, Vasilis, was to explore also these ideas of augmentation. So maybe if I was smarter, I could have patented some of this stuff and actually be sitting back with Oculus Rift money, but that's not the case. And it's not part of the ethos of a lot of the stuff that we're doing. But simple things about seeing how we could develop wearables, ideas of extending interfaces, and one of the reasons that I say that architecture of space is even more important, at this time in particular, and especially from my brother's education, it was moving away from screen, trying to spatialize things, and that's always been at the heart of what motivates a lot of the stuff that we do. At the AA, the first end-of-year show that I did with the students there was to take, with Vasilis, a strategy to make the room as an interface. So the room was like a keyboard, and people would walk on the floor and trigger different kinds of responsive kind of interactive lighting elements, kinetic prototypes. One of the things of sort of working, or what was apparent, was the idea of representation actually didn't necessarily always have a really important place. Actually, it didn't have a place at all. And we started doing drawings like this, which are wire diagrams to explain relationships about how things were actually working and what was connected to what. And very quickly, these diagrams were not about these kind of 90s conversations of digital architecture, if you build a diagram or not, but it's actually very operational. And that operational aspect of it allowed us to also discuss with other kinds of characters. Like, so for example, a lot of the actuated models in this time, around 2002 and 2003, we had Festo as a consultant, but they were engineering actuators. They had no interest in architecture, and they had no way of really understanding why we were doing what we were doing. So we realized very quickly that consultants aren't really the answer, so we have to figure it out ourselves. And maybe this isn't the right way, but it's our way. And as long as we sort of work towards making it work, we accept that there's a lot of failure along the process. And I can only sort of encourage you to fail harder and better, because it forces you in a certain way to ask better questions about what it is that you're doing, to instrumentalize that. And it doesn't matter if we're working on kind of airborne architecture, we'll try to build that stuff and try to see what that is. It doesn't really matter if we're developing strategies of swarm-based robotics. We have no background in these things, but based on the things that I've learned with my brother and my colleagues, we try to share that with the students. The students take that and I think are very clever in their own right and push it in directions which are completely unanticipated. And I think that that part of the process also starts to open up, let's hope that videos work now. Yeah, good. Opens up, I think, an interesting strategy, because not everything is fully understood as you're working through things. So this is an example of a self-assembly project that was in my studio, which we started to develop a strategy for units interacting with other units. We were working in extreme environments. We wanted to develop aggregates that had the capacity to interact with each other and communicate, but also had passive connections and strategies that we could embed through design. We took a version of actuation and spherical packing and all of those different things, but we were coming to it from a perspective because I had asked the students really to explore different extreme environments without consequence. And as we were working on this one, you get a sense from the video that we weren't talking about building stuff here. So the spherical packing was basically about projecting and redesigning a strategy for a space station. And then you could say, well, okay, maybe this is totally science fiction, and Theo, you're just messing around with particles and all of this kind of stuff. And you could say that that's where we started from. But then we tried to organize things, at least in the program that I run, to go out and to speak with some people. So we went to California for a studio trip. We went to the Jet Propulsion Lab. We met with space architects. We asked them lots of questions. Why there are these floating tin cans? Why things are designed the way they are. Part of it is a limitation of what you can get there. It's very expensive, all of these other features. So spherical packing as a default was an amazingly important thing. The second one, we realized very quickly that the atmosphere out there is very different, and it's filled with a lot of space junk. Particles that break projectiles that are basically like super microns that are really going into satellites and all kinds of different features. So we said one of the things that I had asked all the students to think about was on-site materiality. Some people were looking at ice. When we learned about the space junk, then we thought, well, if this thing is moving around, we could start to collect that space junk and to use it as part of the material. So a lot of these kind of magnetic experiments with filaments and all of that other stuff was part of the speculation. As these things are orbiting around, that space dust would become part of the enclosing of these lattices. It's not like we had the brief from the beginning, but it's part of the conversation as you're working through things and decisions are made, and then you sort of keep running with it until actually you can't run any further. One of the challenges here was also there was an orthodoxy in the DRL of modeling things or scripting space, but this is all about constructing not form but formation. There is no modeling. You can only understand things in a completely physics-based environment. So even the challenges of actually working on these kind of projects demands a different kind of working methodology and a different workflow, and these become interesting ways. So what's important to think about is also, I think, some of the trends that come in and out of architecture. So right now it's very popular to talk about robotic fabrication. I'm going to show you some examples of things that we do in terms of robots, but one of the things that we try to do is subvert the fact that, Sajay, who teaches, is basically designing end effectors for industrial robots. I'm rejecting all of that stuff and saying we're going to create completely smart, big robotic stuff, which I'll show you, but there's a history of this world, and it's an evolving one. And one of the things that you learn about history, if you exploit it in a correct way, is like people like Rodney Brooks, who was really arguing for robotics at the M.I.T. Media Lab at the time. He was designing robots and control systems and vision systems and all of that stuff with a very top-down control, like you had to map the world before you actually participated in it. And actually, after 15 years of that, he realized how wrong that was as an approach, and he took the complete opposite approach. And he said, actually, it doesn't really matter. And actually, what we even think is mechanical, he's saying in the future it may not even matter what's mechanical and what is alive. Those distinctions and that boundary may become meaningless. And you'll see that also some of the terminology that was used at that time, we use the same now, but I think we mean something very different. And so there's a certain limitation of language which I think is important. And Kossuth, who was a conceptual artist from the 70s, I think demonstrated really well with this project, which is like 1-3 chairs. If you say chair, the image, the definition, or the object itself all actually suffice in terms of a response to language. But the implications for that, in particular from designers, or even from a discursive or philosophical perspective, it could be radically different, right? And so he was talking about the paradox of this kind of thing and the paradox of language in particular. When I'm speaking about behavior, I want to problematize that a bit further by suggesting that actually, what if the thing itself actually wasn't so certain? What if the thing itself actually constituted its own agency? If a chair understood what it meant to be a chair, its constituting parts, its ability to search, its ability to understand actually what is chair-like and what is a chair, what's chair enough. It's not about the image or representation. This is about understanding that things themselves today have their own agency, and it's not just about how we see things. We have to start to conceptualize how things see things. This opens up, I think, a very interesting thing, where at the same time, this is the world that we live in. Technology is out in the world, and sometimes we want to put it back in the box. But that's not how things work. How things should work, though, is when technologies are out in the world, people inquire and investigate and try to problematize, and that's what I think architects do really well. Because otherwise you can say that the chair actually gives you a problem. Robotic agency and all of these things is a practice that you can say is over 100 years old. But from the 50s onwards, people like Walter Gray Walter were actually developing autonomous robots. Walter Gray Walter was not a roboticist. Walter Gray Walter was actually a man who was trying to communicate how the brain functions, how neurophysiology works, and he was trying to make the argument that simple interconnected systems would exhibit certain behaviors that we would say would be like love, would exhibit hate, would exhibit following, would exhibit different features that have very humanistic aspects. In the 90s, you had people like Carl Sims, who had a very interesting research called Evolving Creatures. And he was talking about a synthetic kind of strategy for developing almost like synthetic biology, evolving virtual creatures that actually had no body plan. They were just like arms and legs, but they weren't really arms and legs. They didn't have a function to it, but based on how they would connect, you would exhibit different forms of creatures and different kinds of technonomies, and the digital environment allows us to think about stuff. In the studio, this is a project that just finished. We work on developing these kind of strategies, particularly in my lab, about unit-to-unit interactions, how things interact with other things, To allow that to happen, each thing has to have its own agency. Each thing has to have at least two states. A mobility state, which is a search state, which is a moving state from A to B, and a self-structuring state. How does it actually create goals to compete with other goals, to create space, for example, if this is like a swarming architecture? So we develop these prototypes, and we try to develop them in a way that demonstrates as a proof of concept that we have the capacity at least to understand how one unit interacts in a mobility mode. We use a lot of digital tools, and there's always this kind of digital analog kind of relationship about trying to understand and forecast what some of those problems would be. There's many different ways to come to a solution to something. So part of the way that I think is very important is not to work in a very linear manner. So for example, you could develop a highly articulated thing itself, but it may have no capacity to interact with other things. And so the issue of population becomes very important, because then we can start to think, well, actually, like almost everything in life, if it's real, synthetic, natural, there's always this kind of give or take. There's always strife in the concept of form. There's always this participation or collaboration for things to be happening in the world. And we try to develop that stuff, and then we try to speculate with that. So if in parallel we develop a certain proof of concept to show how 5 or 6 units could interact together, that gives us more than an assumption to understand how those rule sets could be deployed in higher populations, and using digital platforms as a way to at least begin to articulate. So for example, this is their student, one of my students' group's version of what a chair is. A chair could be anything. This is a chair in a moment in time. When we start to think about a lot of this stuff, and you start to see a contemporary landscape that we're negotiating at the moment, this is a bit of an older article, but the title of it is Future of Tech, Robots and Designer Babies. And you would think that this is part of the funny page section or something, but this is CNN Money, right? These are industries that are very much talking about synthetic biology, gene hacking, all of this kind of stuff, and at the same time, you have characters that have been working on robots for a long time, like Hiroshi Ishiguro, who has been spending most of his life basically trying to build himself. So, you get it, he's the guy on the left, a slightly mechanistic Japanese dude, and his automaton on the right, which is a behavioral creature of himself, where he's trying to teach this robot not only his gestures, his mannerisms. It's not about tricking people. He's really trying to develop it as a form of artificial intelligence. And I'm not going to play too much about this, but his concept is, in Japanese culture, there really doesn't really mean anything about the distinctions of what's natural and artificial. And in his world, this world is not this kind of perverse thing that maybe some other cultures may look at this, but this is actually quite not only natural and contemporary, but this is actually very historically part of the culture of an ecology of how life actually is. Now that it is an automaton and it looks like him is not of consequence, and it actually is not something that's creepy or uncanny valley in this context. In other contexts, we may receive that as saying, well, actually the robot is a little bit weird because it doesn't move, it has this awkwardness to it. That's one aspect of our contemporary condition. The other one is this one, which is usually how we talk about technology. So maybe some of you guys have read about Alphago, which it's kind of like that man versus machine thing that everybody always likes to talk about, but much more complex game. Here you have Lee Sedol, world-renowned Go player, playing against Alphago, all these kind of super smart computational scientists working, studying every possible move, and they sort of play. And the first time he loses, the second time he loses. Every time there's always his humanity made him lose. He was nervous, and he apologizes. He feels like a failure. There's no real conversation about actually the thousands of people that are playing behind the scenes to basically play one person, right? It's always this kind of very simplistic attitude towards technology and machines. It's never really complexified or discussed, and in this case, like, this guy is almost destroyed. I mean, he's a genius, and he has a mental capacity for computation that none of us, I don't want to limit you guys, but at least I don't. And at the same time, for what reason is this conversation going? Actually, if the machine would just learn from him all his moves over the next 10 or 15 years, then maybe AI would go in a very different way, or the system itself would learn in a capacity that's very different, but that's not even part of the conversation. And I think that that's part of the critique of a lot of the things that you hear about artificial intelligence today. It's not that it's bad, it's just how it's been done. How it's being done is being mapped of how the world exists, not how the world could exist. It's not about speculation and scenario, which I think is really fundamental. But to go back to the argument about things having their own agency, this is a Hoover, like the Roomba. Rodney Brooks, who's like a really world-renowned roboticist, his most successful robot is the stupidest robot he's ever designed, which is really a little dial that moves around and hovers around and maps the world when you're not there. And his is a cheap knockoff, and both have vision systems, and both map the world to be able to operate within it. We know this kind of world really a lot more familiar now, the autonomous vehicle, the Google cars, but every vehicle company is designing autonomous systems and vision systems and all of that stuff. And so when you see this isn't really the orthodoxy of top-down or bottom-up or all of this kind of conversations that in some ways start to make this a kind of philosophical conversation about where you start. This is about real time. This is about also decisions that have amazing consequences. So one of the leading things that are being discussed with autonomous vehicles is ethics. So for example, you're teaching a system to take decisions. And what's being used as a classical model at this moment in time is you're in a car and you're driving 45 miles an hour and 3 kids just run into the street. The car has to take a decision. What's the priority? The 3 kids or you? Because you can be run off the street, or do you run through the cars and save yourself? Where is the allegiance for this car? To who? To what? These are like amazingly complex problems to be thought about, and they're not mathematical. And this is the other argument. Computation is not, in my mind, and this is why I talk about behavior-based strategies, it's not about the mathematics of space or mathematics of form. It's not about computing stuff. It's about really trying to find a correlation between things. You know, when we develop self-assembly strategies, we may think of something like designing kind of autonomous vehicles, but we say, well, parking is an issue. We have the Uber systems, we have the on-demand stuff. But our attitude to the car is still ownership model. What if the car was actually something like a mono-wheel? What if parking was actually an opportunity to create temporal space while these things are being charged? Speculations, but they have resonance. When we make other prototypes, same family of the prototype, you also get these kind of behaviors. When some of my students think like, it's kind of like a pet, it's cute, and they make these videos, which they don't show in the presentations, right? These videos aren't really the system organizing or self-organizing. This is our response to these things, which in a way has nothing to do with this is just like 2 acrylic domes and a couple of elastic tubes. It's a pet, it's a creature, it gives us joy and play, and it's because humans have this natural tendency to project lifelike characteristics in things. And this is Walter Gray Walter that I mentioned before. Those tortoises were the hit of the Festival of Britain at the time. But one of the images that he used to explain this was his kid and his wife with the robot, the domestication of this, which I also think was not just by chance. If you look at some of the things that are being explored today, this is Raffaello Di Andrea, who's exploring drones. This experiment is an experiment on the dexterity of the vision system, right? It's totally controlled environment. But I really like this video because it's like, you can play with the drones, or the drones don't really need you, they can play with themselves. And I think it's actually really interesting and exciting because actually nobody really talks about the pleasure of those things. Nobody actually also talks that the real reason why drones are so cheap and deployed is because mobile phones and smartphones have been a technology that's been so explored out in the world that it's made the cost of a lot of the components for this much cheaper. So, in a traditional Cedric Price way, it's kind of his statement or almost dogmatic statement at this stage, technology is the answer, right? He follows that up very quickly with what is the question. And I think that that's really important. It's not that technology is not something outside of us, and that's maybe something else that I would argue. Technology is very much a part of us, and it doesn't mean contemporary gadgets and stuff like that. It's basically our history of working with tools and instruments. And I think particularly to computation within the DRL, I try to strategize that by really acknowledging that we also have very different approaches to that. Patrick, who I've been teaching with now for 16 years, is completely on a parametric kick. Top-down, different kinds of style-driven strategies for how basically one controls the creation of form and space and communication. It's usually quite finite. It's quite powerful in many ways, but it's also limited in others. And I would say the same from my behavioral approach. Does certain things right, does other things actually not so good. And it's not about you choose one. My argument to the students is that all of these things have a time and a place, and it's you guys that should actually really start to explore how you can deploy these kind of strategies. One of the things that's being discussed quite a lot is also about the capacity for machines to learn. Now, this is the most stupid genetic algorithm of machine learning, which is the infinite monkey theorem, which basically says it's really stupid. All it does is just iterate until it gets something close to what the source file actually is, right? That same algorithm could paint a picture of the Mona Lisa. That same algorithm can be deployed to construct a sentence. That same algorithm could be used to play Super Mario Brothers. It's not a kind of cause and effect of one thing has one purpose, has one way. It's not like the Voronoi script becomes a disease in architecture and nobody wants to touch Voronoi anymore. It's not about the aesthetics of this. And these kind of genetic families of all of these things, I think, are really important because, these are not mutated carrots. These are natural carrots that maybe don't look like the ideal carrot. They won't be sold in your supermarkets, but are just as much a carrot as anything else. And one of the things that we have to also challenge is this, the word was used today, perfection, from my young lady in front of me. There's no such thing. If you look at the way that we sort of work on things, we don't actually know if one is better than the other. We know that they're different, and we know that differences can make a difference. Sometimes different is just different, but other times they allow us to sort of open up a conversation. We've been developing a lot of soft robots these days, and when you actuate things, when you start to develop these things themselves, organization really matters. And it's really at the heart of a lot of the things that we're doing, but the way that we develop organizational strategies doesn't necessarily mean geometry. And I would sort of make the argument that it's not just about organization without having aesthetics, without exploring materials. This, for example, is a research that we've been doing using water as a material, right? But also using water as an advancement of actually research like Fahim was doing here, former student who's sitting here. Just if you don't know Fahim, smart guy. And sort of expanding that further. Like, what if this is transparent? What if it's translucent? What if these are strategies for water retention? And when we develop kind of prototypes in the studio, we're trying to develop also scenarios and to try to explore that. So for example, when we were developing units, This is a 3x3 voxel strategy that we've been using, grids, where we just use inflation and try to actuate things in different directions. So you'll see some of the research is going from sphere to cube, some of it is from cube deforming in a certain place, using the sphere to tilt and move this thing. If I ask what the body plan of this thing, the unit, the 3x3x3 grid, is the element itself, but there is no body plan. This is continuously reorganizing, and with that, new behaviors are a product of that, right? To do that means that they actually have to have relationships. So even the cube itself may not communicate as a cube, it may communicate as a face communicating with other faces. The argument that I was having for this research project of 4 years was basically saying that we're not going to deal with scaffolding, we're not going to have a blueprint, we're going to start from zero. And so you do that digitally and you say, okay, that's fine, Theo. Did you make it? And we're trying. So we made one of the units here to have the same behaviors. And we try to control those behaviors. Inflation, deflation, it's a silicon box. We blew up a lot of these things, but we have to create them ourselves. It's not something you just buy off the shelf. And so you design these strategies, and those strategies become really important because at the heart of it, you're learning and constructing an understanding of what it is that you're doing. And the possibilities, and you're giving yourself the space because making makes demands to allow yourself to actually think about ways that this thing could be used. So it's not trying to say that this is a solution for just a problem. This is a prototype that you could speculate could be applied for different things. And so we may start with models which are quite simple, MDF models with some flexibility, and then we'll try to develop actuation strategies that we can control to do that. And then we'll work through simulation in a way to develop those rule sets and then to start to think about how populations can sort of deploy that 200,000, 300,000, a million little creatures doing whatever they're doing. And so one of the things is also it doesn't have to be like state A, state B. So for example, I said no scaffolding. In this context, things are a moment in time. So you could think incrementally of developing strategies where the scaffolding is part of that self-building process. And that's not something new, but it's something that's embedded to the materiality of this kind of stuff, right? So I won't go through too much of this stuff. And if I'm totally boring you, you guys can just tell me to stop. But scenarios, let's say, of 300,000 or 400,000 can be sort of speculated. You couldn't come up with this from the beginning, but as you work in parallel, you can start to also develop strategies to deal with systems. So for example, in the beginning, we were trying to do everything in Maya and trying to use that kind of animation strategies to develop the particle-based systems for that. And then we realized that you couldn't do more than 1,000 particles in a really geometrically tight way. So we had to develop other strategies using different kind of swarm-based systems, looking at My Army, looking at different kinds of tools that we can kind of negotiate to sort of develop strategies to do that. In our work, a little bit, just to kind of conclude with some research on our side, I mean, with my brother and me in parallel, we've always been interested in concepts of enabling. So with Stephen, we've worked on a lot of installations, and maybe that's what we're mostly known for, but we've also worked in contexts like in Norway right now. We're working on a piece of land art there. We've been working in Detroit. We did a version of Memory Cloud, but also been working to discuss a system for a light rail, a temporal strategy for a light rail intervention on Woodward Avenue in Greece, which is where my family is from. We've been working for the last 6 years with Nyarhos Foundation. Renzo Piano has been master planning this area, and we asked to do the illumination aspect for this, 760 acres and 2 thematic landmarks. Our government keeps falling, so I'm not sure if this is ever going to happen in the next 20 years, but you learn the art of patience when you're interested in civic and public work. We do competitions and we do projects. This was a proposal for a nodal island in Korea. We didn't place, we didn't come in the top 10. We've done a lot of installations. One of our first projects was called Face Breeder, and this was an invitation from Archigram's David Green, who asked us to consider what the future of London would be. And so they invited different architects like Zaha and FOA and all of these characters, Foster, and they asked Archigram's David Green. And he basically met us and said, well, you know, he heard a lecture like this. He said, well, why don't you take the window and do something? But you have to make something out of these old junky computers in the basement of Westminster. So we didn't know much about what we were doing, but we took stuff apart, like you do when you feel like you got to do something. And we developed a strategy, which was mostly that, you know, London was really a cultural hybridizing machine. It had very little to do with buildings. Like Foster showed his London bid for the Olympics. We designed a machine that basically was a portrait machine that allowed people to contribute their faces, and it would be bred like in a Chuck Close manner. And you start to see the strangeness of people, with people interacting with this, basically what is like a little photo booth, right? We had a bendy sensor that would click this camera and put it into a populated database, and you start to see that there are some patterns in terms of how people are. People weren't happy with the first picture, so they took a second one, basically just populating our data set. And so the human condition, I think, has always been something that's been very interesting. And so we continuously don't think that any of these projects are actually finished. We continuously revisit them. This was a version that we did at the AA. And so this was the robot that I was talking about. I'll show a video of it. But this is a project called Petting Zoo that's been traveling for the last 4 years now, which was an attempt basically to make a behavioral-based robotic creature, or a series of creatures that would learn from people. So it would graft its interaction relative to your reaction and sort of evolve. And we've done other projects as vehicles with Krzysztof Wodicko. This one opens today actually at the FRAC Centre as part of a show called Reparations. We've done things about emotive houses and self-assembly, or I was sort of thinking about architecture that you could take in your pocket with textiles that can unfold and be casted. We work in really different ways, and each project actually has a radically different sensibility for us. These are some of the kind of tailored textiles that we're doing, casting in concrete and in plaster. These are some of the early studies of Greece that we were developing, some thematic landmarks. If you have the patience, I showed 2 quick projects, and we could call it a day and have a beer or whatever the ritual is here. Maybe the most important project for me and Stephen has been something that we called Memory Cloud. And for the most part, it was after we did Face Breeder with Vasilis Strumpakos. We had enough of machines, so we said, why don't we take the completely different approach and try to construct an atmosphere? And we were doing a lot of experiments with my brother about trying to understand what atmosphere really is. Light, fog, these kind of different experiments. We were being asked to do a lot of things when we first moved back to London for electronic music festivals, particularly stuff for Warp Records and Planet Mu Records, usually things that were happening as an event in the middle of an air base, that kind of pop-up stuff. And we also recognized that we had a lot of people. And so to do a traditional piece of art is kind of pointless when you have a crowd of 1,000 people, or sometimes 5,000 people, or sometimes 200. And so we thought, like, well, how can we develop a strategy to really get people to participate? And this was part of, I think, what's one of the fundamental aspects of the things that we do, is trying to construct a way to develop a model for participation. So we had these concepts of elemental uncertainty, and the real premise behind it was to fuse one of the oldest forms of communication, like smoke signals, which is a over 5,000-year-old practice of creating plumes of smoke, and as a kind of abstract notational system, and on the other hand, using mobile phones, which are interfaces that everybody feels quite comfortable to speak through. It's personal. And we developed it in different contexts. We developed it in London and Bristol. We did it at the ICA in London, and I'll show some pictures. But the one that was the most important for me anyway, and we realized the impact that it could have, was in Detroit. So Detroit is known for, I mentioned today, this kind of ruin porn strategy, like pictures of a shrinking city, a lot of philosophy about what that actually entails, but at the heart of it, there's also a very strong community. And we discovered that from going there that, this is the station that I mentioned in the jury today, which, is an amazingly beautiful derelict thing, but now it's become a monument to Detroit, and it was purchased actually by a couple that owns a bridge gateway to Canada, and they want to make it into an art center, and the debate is, do you do anything with that space, or you just leave the space as it is, and it doesn't need art in it? It stands as a form of communication of a city's past and a reminder of actually the potential of different things. But as we were going through all of the stuff, we were asked to develop this light rail system, but like a lot of things in Detroit, they don't have money to put lights on in certain streets. So the woman that I'm walking with here, Becky Hart, she was an amazing curator. She asked me, with another woman, Becky from the ICA, if we would do Memory Cloud as a way to communicate with the general public some of our motivations. Because one of the things that we had to deal with is why bring an international group of artists to do something when there's so many artists here. We made the argument and we tried to propose what we did with the ICA. So what me and my brother said to the ICA is that we want to animate the built environment through conversation. That was it. There wasn't an image to it. And we suggested that the stage for that be Trafalgar Square. So Trafalgar Square, if you've been in London, is a very civic public space, but it's always been a space of communication, protest, celebration, all of these things. We showed them our smoke signal experiments, whatever. We developed that strategy there for 3 nights. In London, to be honest with you, it was very popular. It was on BBC. The weatherman came to do his stuff there. We had 7 people propose to each other. The ICA wanted them to get married at the ICA. All of this kind of stuff. But then we took a 2-year hiatus from this, and we've only done it one more time, which was in Detroit. If in London the comments were mixed, some were novel, some of them were very serious. The challenges behind a project like that is you're creating an open platform for anybody to say something. It's large population of gathering. This was in 2008, where there was a lot of religious strife in terms of people saying a lot of stuff to incite a lot of things. So there were a lot of challenges and logistics, and it took us 1.5 years to actually get it to happen, right? In Detroit, it was really different. 3 months in advance to all of this stuff. Local schools, art institutions, all wanted to engage the community. They felt that this actually potentially could be a mechanism to have a conversation that you can't really have. If you read some of these are pieces of poetry, collectively co-authored from different people, but expressed in a way that was quite ephemeral and made the building itself speak to the city, use the city as a kind of canvas. Long story short, same medium, all of that kind of stuff, haiku workshops at the ICA, 3 nights at a museum which has an amazingly civic entry to it, right? But the daily realities of the DIA, which has the 3rd most valued art collection in the States, was this entrance is closed for security reasons. They don't have enough staff. You have to understand, there's context for everything. And that the building itself is, the city of Detroit is not a walking city, and the center of the city is basically museums that are closed and university and libraries that are also closed. So we were doing this Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night. And this is Sunday night. And you have a host of different people stumbling onto it. We had local gangs coming over. We had an old woman, which I'll show you because she's pretty cool, this lady here, who thought that the Detroit Institute of Arts was on fire. She was 84 years old, and hopefully she's still around. She came to put it out. We put a website together because one of the things that we want to do, there was a discussion about memory today. All of our pieces are recording devices. All of that stuff you could read if you're interested in. It's something called Voice of Detroit. Why we think is the most important project for us particularly is that we got a letter from the curators, from a foundation in Detroit and from the city of Detroit, which basically said that they've had some conversations after this and they want to put together a light biennale, as inspired by some of the stuff that we did. And so the light biennale is called De-Electricity, and this is the third year, this is the third version of it that's happening since then. And it's quite successful. And what was maybe like 50 or 100 people outside now is happening in multiple sites throughout the city. And it was a way to bring in outside artists and also explore young talents and students and local artists and actually explore the city, which is continuously changing, right? And it's an initiative, let's say, for example, that the mayor would destroy 1,000 houses to tear them down because they were derelict each year. The landscape, the physical landscape of the city is changing. And for us, I think it was just a really interesting opportunity because these statements actually provoked people to just basically understand themselves a little bit better. And they did that because the architecture or the art piece or whatever was nothing more than a platform for people to actually speak. That world is very different from petting zoo, and maybe I'll finish with petting zoo, because it's the complete opposite. If before in Face Breeder we were contributing, people would contribute their portraits or a message, there was a very direct relationship with what it is that they were giving. This one, there's no contribution. This is just stumbling onto a robot, and a robot that is gesturing and a robot that interacts with you. And a lot of those references that I talked to you guys before are obviously references that are important to me and to my brother and to our practice because they made us think about things a little bit differently. This project has had two lives. One of them was at the FRAC Centre, which was in a black box. Ideas of walking through that. Do you put a barrier around it or not? I'll show you some videos from that, but the other one was actually to do it in the atrium of the Barbican Centre. So when we showed it a second time, we said, no, it's going to be totally public. It's going to be in the most public space at the Barbican for a show that was called Digital Revolution, and how people would actually deal with this. So it is a piece of kinetic sculpture, but its gestures change. It's using sound and light and kinetics. But it's also using a vision system to understand itself. And we started off not knowing much about vision systems. We used to do kind of camera recognition strategies for like a project we showed at MOMA called Becoming Animal. This project was very much enabled by the fact that Kinect was out in the world and it was cheap to use, to buy. But this wasn't like just about hacking things. This is when Microsoft basically released their libraries that we could actually work with those things. And working with those things was important because we did something which I think is important, which is actually use two libraries in particular. One is the skeletal one, which recognizes your physical movements, and the other one was blob detection. So blob detection is basically how the system is mapping bodies in space. And in this system, every person basically gets mapped and gets a color codification, and the blob detection has a limited memory of basically that kind of outline. So I'm the heavy-set dude in there, and I have two of my colleagues running around. And digitally, we would start to work on this stuff, and we would say, okay, it's starting to move into a certain direction. But what was the real challenge was, how does that mitigate with hardware? The hardware stuff, if the software stuff took us basically, let's say, 3/4 of a year, the hardware stuff took us 2 years of just making prototypes that all looked kind of the same but behaved differently. The project itself was received in different ways, right? So at the FRAC, I'll show you the videos, it was received quite well. At the Barbican, it was also really received well. The whole idea of a digital revolution was really important, and it got a lot of press. Like, this is basic stuff from the Times, New York Times, and things like that. But these were like, generally the press started with a review of the show. And then, as time goes on, the show was on for 2.5 months, we started to get very different kinds of press. So Wired did 5 features on petting zoo. And you start to see that the titles start to change. And one of the things that I think is important when we put these things out into the world is that the culture around the observation of the thing itself changes. At the FRAC, it was an art installation in a traditional sense. The only thing that they were really inspired by is that you could walk through them and nobody got hurt. In this context, to be honest, you start to see a bizarre petting zoo that's going to replace animals. The local metro, which is like our everyday kind of metro newspaper, starts to talk about a kind of sci-fi version that these kind of squids are loose in the Barbican and, you know, they're doing bad things to people. And then you get people coming from different parts of the world. I don't think you guys understand Russian, but I can tell you I didn't. But I have a student who does. And so I had a Russian TV crew come for about 6 hours in my office, interested in understanding the project, and I tried to go into details about everything, right? I'm like, so there's no miscommunication. What she's basically saying in this 2.5-minute feature on primetime news is Theo and Stephen are new to London, but they've been living here for 15 years and they've never been to the zoo. So they thought they should create their own zoo. Theo and Stephen basically don't believe that animals should be in cages, so they think that robots should be in cages instead. Then in this part, it started to get creepy, and one of the reasons why I asked my students to translate this was it starts talking about proletariat, capitalist, something about Marxist, blah, blah, blah. I didn't know. But basically, she was trying to explain how the behaviors worked, because there's an angry mode. So she was basically trying to say, if you play nice with it, it plays nice with you. But if you misbehave, it gets angry and, you know, basically disciplines you. So that's a very strange way to interpret your project. But then it gets a little bit weirder. She asked me if she could take one of the prototypes of one of the legs. They want to record something outside in the square. I said, okay, sure, take it. She comes back 45 minutes later, and she tells me, you know, Theo, I hope in the future that architects like you and your brother don't just design animals, but design people too. So I was a bit weirded out by that, but there's the ending of this is her with this thing, like a scarf, just kind of standing there saying these things to the general public. The only thing she said is that they should be softer. Like, this was the only thing that she was saying. It was a bit creepy. I didn't know where to go with it, but we're supposed to show this in Japan, which has a history of hentai cartoons. And we showed this in Sweden, and we couldn't use petting zoo as the title, because petting zoo meant something very bad, and it was a science museum, and children would be there. And I'm saying this because there's an aspect of the culture around these things that is becoming very interesting for me and my brother, at least to describe an understanding of what we're doing, because we never really foreground technologies. I mean, I do have to talk about that stuff to my students, but the cultural representation of how these things are sort of brought about into the world, I think, is very important, because it does kind of open up a very interesting discourse. I don't know if there's time for one last one. Are you guys totally dead? This is a short one. It's the one that we're working on now. And it's maybe where it's a very different scale, which we've been working on something called Emotive City. And it was an invitation to talk about the future of machines and something that Nesta puts forward called Future Fest. So Nesta is the innovation department of the UK. So just so that you understand that this isn't all about play. They asked us to talk about the future of machines, and we made the argument that infrastructure and architecture is the future of machines. And the premise behind that was really to talk about the city. So, for example, infrastructure in London is always never enough. Infrastructure in Detroit, for example, is always too much now. The promise of the city, this is a cover of 1918, was that the city itself would be this three-dimensional organism, or you could say four-dimensional organism, flying machines, things underground, buildings interconnected. This was the vision, or the promise. This was the transit authorities' call to visualize London in 2026. This is 2 years old. this is what the Transport Authority put out in the world. It looks like London. It's not even the real London of all the towers that are being proposed. It's a very different thing, that London somehow is slightly more entertainment-oriented, right? So you have something like the London Wheel, or the London Eye, which was supposed to be something temporary, but it works. It funds itself. It funds negotiating that property that it sits on. The rest of the future of London is really just carnival, circus. And this is the optimistic version, right? There are other versions of thinking about the city, and London is no different. And you have this world, which is totally generic, which is response is actually nothing to do with context, nothing to do with place or purpose. It's not even about capital. It's just shitty design, right? If you would allow me that affordance. I know it's recorded and probably be online and all that stuff, but anyway. I'm unapologetic by the fact that say that this is not only horrible, but there's no design in this. This isn't even building. This is really the lowest common denominator. And part of the challenge that we have is not about constructing vision, but enabling versions to deal with latency and uncertainty, right? This is Kenzo Tange. He was asked to design a city for 8 million people, right? This was a real project. This didn't fail because of lack of vision or about an amazing obsession for design. This failed because the systems that would allow this thing to adapt, the conversations to evolve with things, were not there. So my argument would be that computation is probably our only tool for that. And then it's an important one because at the same time that there's an argument for generating cities and all of that other stuff, there is real-world technologies that are being deployed in the cities, right? So the smart car, the vehicle, all of this stuff is something that's happening. It happened in London. It stopped because of very specific problems, like the ethics issue that I was talking to you about. Rem, who is also one of our AA alums, his attitude towards a smart city is that it's stupid, that smart cities are fundamentally dumb, we don't need to talk about this stuff, we should talk about rural areas and things like this. This is basically from a man who made his whole life really talking about the city and urbanism and so forth, making the argument that none of these things are actually really important and architects should kind of fundamentally reject this. You could fundamentally reject it, but it's happening. And either you participate, engage it, and actually synthesize this in the way that makes it a design problem, or you just watch it. And by watching it, you're a passive observer, and part of the problem is what I would make the argument, right? And part of the issue is that artificial intelligence also has some of the leading smart guys and girls of the world making an argument that some of these things we should be fearful of. But they're talking about how it's being done, not the concept of AI. And I think that that distinction is really important because these short, little blips or tweets or little kind of statements in the newspaper don't really discuss the real issues at plan. Right? Where are we going there? Okay, so this is DARPA. DARPA is the defense agency in the States, right? So this is the DARPA Olympics. And so this fear that we have about robots taking over all of this kind of stuff is not really the problem. Actually, not only are they clumsy and these tasks very difficult for them, they're also very legible, right? We understand them as technologies. The things that are invisible, the things that are happening all around us, the invisible stuff that's here, those are the things that are a little bit fearful because actually we don't understand their abstraction. We don't understand how they work. This stuff, really like the sci-fi Will Smith version of stuff, is not the problem. And neither are these things. But these things fundamentally don't change our city either. They just bring back congestion in a different form, right? It really is like an Uberless driver Uber. Just why Uber is doing that stuff. It doesn't, I mean, I don't know how many conversations. I like to converse with my Uber driver or my taxi driver. Maybe it'll be an AI version of that conversation, but fundamentally it doesn't change how you live in the city, operate with the city, on demand, any of that stuff. So those things aren't really going to change anything. We took residency in Somerset House, so we were invited basically to move Minimaforms there for 2.5 years. And one of the things that's happening in London, and this is our current mayor, is really about bringing culture and design and a lot of these problems to open them sort of up for interrogation. So we had a show at the launch where we showed Emotive City. And Emotive City basically was a speculative project. The idea was really to make a self-organizing city. The rules of its organization were really about saying that if each house, each dwelling, took on the behaviors of the people that are living in it, took on the decisions and the flexibility to develop communities, almost like in an old school village strategy, that we could develop a strategy that's not tied to infrastructure. And we speculated by designing these systems, and we made two statements. We said architecture today must participate and engage with the information-rich environments that are shaping our lives by constructing frameworks that allow for change and embrace the unknown. And the second was models of the past can't operate as blueprints for our future. When science fiction has become fact, architecture today has to move beyond representation and beyond the fixed and finite tendencies that declare what architecture should be and work towards what it could be. And I'll just show you this video, which is a kind of synopsis of it, right? So the idea, we made these spherical bots like this. So they're phototropic bots. They're kind of like how Walter Gray Walter's bots were working. So they can communicate with each other. They can attract or repel each other. They can communicate, and we tied these things onto Twitter feeds and the TFL's kind of live stream. So we said those kind of things will have an influence about how social or antisocial these bots would be. And we made about 12 of them in the space. Then we speculated about 1,500 units. So we designed two models, which were basically aggregates of 1,500s. It's kind of like a computational state machine. And we use reaction diffusion as a kind of strategy for different clusters that are within that. So holistically, each one of those spheres is symbolic of a unit, as a house, as a dwelling. The behaviors, the flickering effects, all of that kind of stuff is how these clusters communicate with each other. And we made the argument that we could have a strategy for a kind of human-machine ecology, which is basically arguing that the machine itself is nothing without the human agent within it, right? The behaviors, the things that drive it, its concept of mobility. But there are strategies of convergence, community, clustering. And so we tried to basically develop this as a kind of way of addressing some of these things. So maybe I leave this video up if there's any kind of questions I could sort of ask. But the strategy of it was to really speculate that there is no finite blueprint, that these things could be distributed to the existing city, but it were migratory. This kind of idea of the sort of nomadism of 60s, 70s utopia that was in parallel with those airstreams and getting in your car and driving somewhere, we basically said, well, what if houses could be like that? What if I had the choice of actually taking my house with me? What if communities could migrate and that my house and my personal effects and all of those things could migrate with me? What if every time I go home and see my house actually proposes my living environment for that night, right? So you see all of those little self-assembly stuff we do in the DRL. What if that environment actually could transform itself? This is a world that you may say, like, okay, I'm just losing it. I'm sitting with a lot of robots for a little bit too long, and it's partly true. But the other thing is, like, that world could happen. A lot of things could happen. Part of the thing that I think is really important for architects today and artists and designers is to think that these things are important to speculate. Because I've had very serious conversations about this with roboticists, with computer scientists. I get invited to basically speak at these kind of AI conferences too. The only way that I speak on that, I'm not on that mind space like those guys, but actually the proof of concepts demonstrate things that they've never really thought about. And makes it a very interesting convergence, because making something is a demonstration of knowledge. And that kind of puts itself out into the world, and it's not about creating interdisciplinary design, it's about provoking and constructing a framework for a kind of conversation that can be enabled through the act of design and creating itself. And that's how we work in the DRL. We don't have a robotics lab, and Minimaforms, to be honest with you, is a much more streamlined version of that. But I think at the end of the day, that doesn't stop us actually from working on these problems. And I think one of the things that you'll find out, you can go to Harvard that gets $3.5 million grants to develop a bot like that, or you can go to the DRL and basically spend 50 pounds on silicone, and to be honest with you, the differences are not that different. I'm not saying this out of arrogance, I'm just stating it as fact. The actual proof of concept, the actual systems themselves, they work with the same tools and techniques that we do. So it's not something that is outside of us to work on these problems. I would just encourage you that these are the contemporary problems. It doesn't change space making and making homes and programmatic stuff, but it does add a different layer that I think is important for you to explore. If you don't, then who will? Is a kind of question that I would ask you as a community.